The fluorescent lights of the county courthouse flickered like dying stars above Maria Castellanos as she clutched the crumpled $20 bills in her sweaty palm. $800. That's all she had left after paying rent, buying groceries with expired coupons, and keeping the lights on in their tiny apartment where Danny, Stardamat's age 7, slept on a mattress they'd found on the sidewalk 3 months ago. $800 between her family and complete destitution. "Next!" The clerk's voice cut through the humid air like a rusty blade. Maria stepped forward, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor that reflected a woman she barely recognized anymore. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her once proud shoulders now curved inward from the weight of a world that seemed determined to crush her spirit. But something flickered in those brown eyes, something her brothers had never bothered to notice, something that burned brighter than the shame they'd tried to heap upon her. "I'm here about the Castellanos property auction," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The old copper mine up on Devil's Ridge." The clerk, a heavy-set woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked up from her computer screen with the expression of someone who'd seen too many desperate people clutch at impossible dreams. "Honey, that mine's been dead for 30 years. Your daddy tried to make something of it, your granddaddy before him, nothing but fool's gold and broken dreams up there." Her jaw tightened. "How much is the minimum bid?" $800. The clerk's laugh was bitter as day-old coffee. "Though I can't imagine why anyone would want that cursed piece of rock. The Castellanos family's been trying to squeeze blood from that stone for generations." The irony wasn't lost on Maria. Her own family name, spoken like a warning, a cautionary tale whispered in the coffee shops and church pews of their small mountain town. The Castellanos curse, they called it. Every generation, someone would pour their life savings into that mine, convinced they'd be the one to strike it rich. Her great-grandfather had died in those tunnels. Her grandfather had lost his farm trying to finance the dream. Her father had spent every weekend for 20 years digging deeper, always convinced the next blast would reveal the treasure that would change everything. "I'll take it," Maria said, counting out the bills with hands that trembled not from fear, but from something else entirely. Something that felt dangerous and electric and alive. The clerk's eyes widened. "Sweetheart, you sure about this? I've got 3 boys waiting outside. Look like they'd rather die than see you walk away with that property. Your brothers, I'm guessing?" Through the courthouse windows, Maria could see them. Marcus, the eldest at 35, built like their father but with none of his dreamer's heart. He wore his success like armor, the expensive suit, the gold watch, the BMW parked at an angle that screamed entitlement. James, 2 years younger, leaned against Marcus's car with his arms crossed, his real estate license glinting in his shirt pocket like a badge of superiority. And Roberto, only a year older than Maria's 28, but already soft around the middle from his comfortable life managing his uncle's restaurant chain. They'd all been at the family meeting 6 months ago. The meeting where they'd decided Maria wasn't financially responsible enough to inherit any part of their father's estate. The meeting where they'd divided up the profitable properties, the rental houses, the commercial lots in town, and the pristine acreage that would soon become a shopping center. They'd left her with nothing but condescending smiles and advice about getting her life together. "The mine's worthless," Marcus had said, not even bothering to look at her as he signed the papers. "Nothing but a hole in the ground and Dad's old fantasies. We're putting it up for auction just to get it off the books. Tax liability, you understand?" They understood numbers, her brothers. Profit margins and market values and quarterly projections. What they never understood was the fire that had burned in their father's eyes every time he talked about the mine. The way he'd traced geological maps with fingers stained by honest work, pointing out ore veins and fault lines like other men traced constellations. They'd seen only his failures, not his passion, his debt, not his dreams. "Yes," Maria said, sliding the money across the counter with finality. Outside, Maria could see Marcus pacing, his phone pressed to his ear. Probably calling his lawyer, she thought, or their mother, who would clutch her rosary and mutter about Maria's poor judgment in rapid-fire Spanish. The 3 brothers had been banking on no one showing up to the auction. They'd get the property back for unpaid taxes in a few years, clean and simple. But Maria had shown up. The daughter they'd dismissed, the sister they'd abandoned, the single mother they'd written off as a cautionary tale. She'd shown up with $800 and a heart full of the same stubborn determination that had driven generations of Castellanos men into those dark tunnels. The paperwork felt heavier than it should in her hands. Deed to 47 acres of worthless mountain property, including mineral rights and water access. The same mineral rights her brothers had been too arrogant to research properly, too successful in their strip mall world to understand the changing value of rare earth elements in a technology-hungry world. As she walked toward the courthouse doors, Maria could feel their eyes on her like laser sights. Marcus stepped forward first, his face red with barely contained rage. "Maria, what the hell do you think you're doing? You can't afford this. You can barely afford to feed that kid of yours." "That kid has a name," Maria said quietly, not stopping. "His name is Danny." "Don't get smart with us," James interjected, his realtor's smile never wavering, even as his voice turned sharp. "We're trying to help you here. That mine is a money pit. You'll lose everything you just spent, plus whatever you sink into it trying to make it work." Roberto, ever the peacemaker, stepped closer with his hands raised. "Mija, be reasonable. We know you're angry about the inheritance, but this isn't the way to prove a point. Sell us the deed. We'll give you $1,000 for it right now. $200 profit for 5 minutes work." Maria stopped at the top of the courthouse steps and turned to face them. The afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and copper, and for a moment she could see her father standing there instead of her brothers. Papa, with his work-worn hands and his unshakable belief that the mountain would provide for his family if they just had faith enough to dig deep enough. "You know what Dad used to tell me about mine?" she said, her voice carrying across the courthouse plaza. "He said it was waiting for the right person at the right time. Someone who needed it as much as it needed them." "Dad was a dreamer who died broke," Marcus spat, "and you're following right in his footsteps." "Maybe," Maria said, folding the deed carefully and sliding it into her purse. "But at least I'm following something." "What are you following, Marcus? Quarterly profit reports? James, when was the last time you built something instead of just selling it? And Roberto, do you even remember what it feels like to take a risk on anything?" She started down the steps, her brothers trailing behind like angry shadows. "You'll come crawling back," James called after her. "When you're broke and desperate and that kid of yours is asking why Mommy made such a stupid decision, you'll come crawling back." Maria paused at her beat-up Honda Civic, its paint faded and its bumper held on with duct tape. She looked back at her brothers, standing there in their expensive clothes next to their luxury cars, and she felt something shift inside her. Not anger. Anger was too small for this moment. This was something larger, something that tasted like mountain air and possibility. "You know what the difference is between me and you?" she said. "You look at that mine and see what it's not. I look at it and see what it could be." She drove away with her brother's curses following her like smoke, but she was already thinking ahead. Thinking about soil samples and geological surveys, and the geology textbooks she'd checked out from the library every summer as a teenager, desperate to understand what her father saw in those dark tunnels. Thinking about the way Danny's eyes lit up when she told him stories about treasure hunters and lost fortunes. Most of all, she was thinking about the letter she'd found in her father's things after his funeral. A letter from a mining consultant dated just 3 months before his death, talking about promising indicators and potential platinum deposits and further testing recommended. A letter her brothers had never seen because they'd been too busy dividing up the profitable assets to pay attention to their father's worthless obsession. As she pulled into the parking lot of her apartment complex, Maria Castellanos smiled for the first time in months. Tomorrow, she would drive up to Devil's Ridge and walk the land that was now hers. She would stand at the mouth of the mine that had swallowed 3 generations of Castellanos' dreams and decide whether she had the courage to become the 4th. But tonight, she would tuck Danny into bed and tell him a story about a princess who bought a dragon's cave for $800, never knowing that the dragon had been guarding the greatest treasure in the kingdom. If this story of courage against impossible odds resonates with you, it takes just a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that their dreams matter too. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who need hope most. Outside her window, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like the echo of blasting powder in abandoned tunnels. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the pre-dawn darkness of Maria's studio apartment like a blade through silence. 4:30 a.m. She'd been awake for an hour already, staring at the water-stained ceiling and running calculations in her head. $800 for the mine, $43 left in her checking account, rent due in 12 days, Danny's school lunch account showing a negative balance that made her stomach clench with familiar shame. She rolled out of the twin mattress she shared with her son, careful not to wake him. In the gray half-light filtering through their single window, Danny looked impossibly small. His dark hair tousled against the pillow they'd stuffed with old t-shirts when the original filling had compressed to nothing. His school backpack sat in the corner, held together with safety pins and hope, containing homework he'd completed by the light of their neighbor's porch lamp when their electricity had been shut off last month. Maria pulled on her McDonald's uniform in the cramped bathroom, the fluorescent light buzzing like an angry wasp. The mirror reflected a woman she was still learning to recognize, 28 years old but carrying the weight of someone decades older. When had those lines appeared around her eyes? When had her hands become so rough, so permanently stained with the smell of industrial cleaning products and fast food oil? 3 years ago, she'd been Maria Castellanos, the college graduate with a degree in geology, working as a junior surveyor for a mining company in Denver. She'd had plans then, dreams of becoming a consulting geologist, maybe starting her own environmental testing firm. She'd had Jake too, charming Jake with his easy smile and his promises of forever, right up until the pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines and forever suddenly became too long for him to contemplate. "I'm not ready to be a father," he'd said, as if readiness was something you could schedule like a dental appointment. "We're too young, Maria. This isn't the plan." But Danny had become her plan, her purpose, her entire universe compressed into 7 pounds and 3 ounces of perfect, helpless humanity. And when the mining company downsized and her position was eliminated, when Jake stopped returning her calls and her savings dwindled to nothing, when her family made it clear that her mistakes were hers alone to bear, well, plans had a way of changing whether you were ready or not. The bus ride to work took 43 minutes, winding through neighborhoods that grew progressively more prosperous as they moved away from her complex. She watched through smudged windows as other people lived other lives, jogging with expensive dogs, loading children into SUVs that cost more than she'd make in 3 years, stepping out of houses with actual yards where kids could play without worrying about broken glass and discarded needles. At McDonald's, she tied her hair back and painted on the smile that had become as much a part of her uniform as the polyester shirt and non-slip shoes. "Welcome to McDonald's, how can I help you?" Thousands of times she'd spoken those words. They'd become a mantra, a meditation on endurance. "Maria, you're on breakfast shift," called Sandra, the assistant manager who'd become something like a friend over the past 2 years. Sandra was older, weathered by decades of service industry work, but she had kind eyes and never made Maria feel small for the choices that had led her here. "And hey, you okay? You look like you haven't slept." "I'm fine," Maria lied, because the truth was too complicated to explain while breakfast rush was bearing down on them like a freight train. How could she explain that she'd spent $800, money they desperately needed, on a dream that might be nothing more than fool's gold? How could she explain the way her heart had raced when she'd signed those papers, or the way her brother's contempt had felt like gasoline on a fire she'd been trying to extinguish for years? The morning passed in a blur of coffee orders and breakfast sandwiches, of teenagers complaining about their hash browns and businessmen who snapped their fingers to get her attention. Each customer was a small reminder of the distance between where she was and where she'd once planned to be. The geology degree that had cost her 4 years and $50,000 in student loans felt as distant as a childhood fairy tale. During her break, she called Danny's school to check on his lunch account. "Mrs. Castellanos?" The secretary's voice was professionally sympathetic. "Danny's account is showing a negative balance of $37. We'll need you to bring in payment by Friday, or he'll need to bring lunch from home." $37. It might as well have been 37,000. Maria stared at her phone's cracked screen and felt the familiar burn of tears she couldn't afford to shed. Not here. Not at work. "I'll take care of it," she said, because what else could she say? That she'd spent their food money on a worthless mine because she'd been too proud to watch her brothers dismiss her one more time? That she'd gambled with her son's security on a letter she'd found in her dead father's papers and a gut feeling she couldn't explain? Back at the register, the lunch rush began with its own particular brand of chaos. Maria moved through it mechanically, part of her mind always working on the impossible math of their survival. If she picked up extra shifts, if she sold the few pieces of jewelry she had left, if she somehow managed to stretch their groceries another week. "Excuse me, are you Maria Castellanos?" She looked up to find a man in his 50s standing at her register, wearing a flannel shirt and work boots that suggested he was more comfortable outdoors than in fluorescent-lit fast food restaurants. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked with the kind of deep lines that came from squinting at horizons and reading the stories written in stone and soil.
"Yes, can I help you?" "My name's Tom Hendricks. I'm a geologist, and I heard through the grapevine that you bought the old Castellanos mine yesterday." His eyes were sharp, intelligent, studying her with the intensity of someone accustomed to seeing what others missed. "I knew your father." Maria's heart began to race. Around her, the lunch rush continued its relentless pace, but suddenly the noise seemed muted, distant. "You knew my father?" "Worked with him on a consulting basis about 4 years ago. Your dad hired me to do some preliminary testing on the mine property." Tom glanced around, taking in the golden arches and the smell of French fry oil that permeated everything. "Look, I know you're working, but is there somewhere we could talk? What I have to tell you, it's important." Sandra appeared at her elbow, having sensed the shift in Maria's demeanor with the intuition of someone who'd managed people for decades. "Maria, why don't you take your lunch break early? I'll cover your register." They sat in Tom's pickup truck in the McDonald's parking lot, the engine running to keep the air conditioning going in the August heat. Tom pulled a manila folder from behind his seat, its contents thick enough to suggest serious research. "Your father was a good man, but he was working on intuition more than science. He hired me to do proper geological surveys, soil sampling, core drilling, the works." He opened the folder, revealing maps and charts and photographs that made Maria's pulse quicken. "What I found, well, let's just say your brothers made a very expensive mistake yesterday." The first photograph showed a cross-section of rock, shot through with veins of something that gleamed silver-white even in the artificial light. "Platinum," Tom said quietly. "High-grade platinum ore, running deeper and wider than anything your father could have dreamed." But that's not the best part. He turned to another page, this one covered with calculations and estimates that made Maria's head spin. The assay suggested the deposit worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million, maybe more, depending on how deep it runs and how the market moves. Maria stared at the papers, her hands trembling as she tried to process what she was hearing. $300 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, meaningless, like trying to count grains of sand on a beach. "Why didn't you tell my father?" she whispered. Tom's face darkened. "I tried. I called him the day after I got the final assay results back from the lab. That was 3 months before he died. But when I called, your brother Marcus answered. Said your father was in the hospital, couldn't take calls about his mining fantasies. Marcus told me to send my report to the family lawyer and they'd handle it appropriately." The words hit Maria like physical blows. Marcus had known. He'd known and he'd buried the report, buried the truth, buried his father's vindication along with the man himself. "I sent the report," Tom continued, "but I never heard back from anyone. When your father died, I tried to reach out to the family again, but your brothers made it clear they thought the whole mining operation was a waste of time. They wanted to wash their hands of it." Maria closed her eyes, seeing her father's face in those final months, the way his shoulders had sagged with defeat. He'd died thinking he was a failure, thinking his life's work had been nothing more than an old man's delusion.
And all the while, Marcus had been sitting on proof that his father had been right about everything. "There's something else," Tom said gently. "The property you bought yesterday, it includes not just the main mine, but the mineral rights to the entire 47 acres. Your brothers sold you one of the most valuable pieces of land in the state for $800. The laughter that escaped her throat sounded more like a sob. "I can't afford to develop it. I can barely afford to feed my son. What good is $300 million of platinum if I can't get to it?" That's where things get interesting. Tom pulled out another set of papers. "I've been keeping an eye on this deposit for years, hoping someday I'd get a chance to work on it properly. I've got contacts, mining companies, investors, people who understand the value of what you've got there. With the right backing, you could be looking at extraction within 18 months. He handed her a business card that felt heavy with possibility. "But here's the thing, Maria. Once word gets out about what's really up there, you're going to have every mining company in North America knocking on your door. Your brothers are going to realize their mistake, and there are going to be people who will try to take advantage of you, convince you to sell for a fraction of what it's worth." Maria stared at the card, her mind racing through implications and possibilities she'd never dared to consider. "What do I do?" "First, you need a lawyer, a good one, who specializes in mineral rights and mining contracts. Second, you need to be very careful about who you trust. And third," Tom smiled, and for a moment she could see in his weathered features an echo of her father's eternal optimism. "Third, you need to remember that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the biggest rewards."
The rest of her shift passed in a haze. Every order she took, every coffee she poured, felt surreal, disconnected from the new reality spinning through her mind. $300 million. More money than she could conceptualize, hidden beneath 47 acres of scrubland that her brothers had dismissed as worthless. When she picked Danny up from after-school care, he chattered excitedly about his day, the story they'd read about pirates, the art project he'd made with construction paper.
The offices of Cordova Mining Consortium occupied 3 floors of the nicest building in town. Glass and steel rising above the old downtown like a promise of prosperity. Maria had never imagined she'd walk through these doors as anything other than someone begging for a job. Now, the security guard nodded respectfully as he directed her to the executive elevator. Elena Cordova was waiting in her corner office, and Maria understood immediately why this woman had built one of the most successful mining operations in the Southwest. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a way that was elegant but practical, and eyes that seemed to catalog and assess everything they saw. But when she smiled at Maria, the expression was warm, genuine. "Ms. Castellanos, please sit. Can I offer you coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be great, thank you." Maria settled into a leather chair that probably cost more than she made in 2 months, trying not to let her nervousness show. "I've reviewed Tom Hendricks' geological reports," Elena said, settling behind her desk with 2 steaming mugs. "I've also had my own team do independent verification. What you have up on Devil's Ridge, it's extraordinary." She opened the laptop and turned the screen toward Maria. Satellite imagery showed the mine property from above, but overlaid with colored sections that meant nothing to Maria's untrained eye. "The platinum veins run in 3 primary directions," Elena explained, using a laser pointer to trace the patterns. "Based on core samples from 12 different locations, we're looking at one of the richest platinum deposits discovered in North America in the last 50 years. Our conservative estimate is $400 million in extractable platinum. Our optimistic estimate," she paused, meeting Maria's eyes, $800 million. $800 million. Maria felt the number settle in her chest like a physical weight. More money than she could comprehend, hidden beneath land that had been in her family for generations. "Here's what I'm proposing. Cordova Mining will handle all aspects of development and extraction. We'll provide the initial investment, approximately $50 million for equipment, infrastructure, and environmental compliance. In return, we take a 60% stake in the operation. You retain 40% ownership and receive quarterly payments based on extraction proceeds. Elena slid a thick contract across the desk. Our preliminary calculations suggest you'd be looking at somewhere between $12 and $20 million annually once we reach full production, for the next 20 to 30 years. Maria stared at the contract, its legal language dense and intimidating. But the numbers at the bottom were clear enough. Even at the conservative estimate, she was looking at enough money to ensure Danny could go to any college he wanted, that they'd never worry about rent or food or medical bills again. "There is one complication," Elena said gently. "I received a call this morning from a law firm representing Marcus, James, and Roberto Castellanos. They're claiming the mineral rights sale was invalid, that you didn't have legal authority to purchase them." "What?" Maria looked up sharply. "I bought the property at a public auction. Everything was legal." "I'm sure it was, but they're threatening to tie this up in court, which could delay development for years. Litigation like this, it's expensive, time-consuming, and there's always risk." Elena leaned forward. "They also made me a direct offer to purchase the mining rights from them, claiming they're the rightful owners." The coffee turned bitter in Maria's mouth. Of course. Her brothers had finally figured out what they'd lost, and now they wanted it back. "What did you tell them?" "That we only deal with the legal owner of the record, which is you. But Maria, I need you to understand what you're up against. Your brothers have resources, connections, expensive lawyers. They're going to make this as difficult as possible." As if summoned by their conversation, Elena's assistant knocked and entered. "Miss Cordova, there are 3 gentlemen here to see you. They say it's urgent regarding the Castellanos mining contract." Maria's stomach dropped. Through the office's glass walls, she could see them in the reception area. Marcus in his $1,000 suit, James with his practiced realtor's smile, Roberto looking uncomfortable but determined. They'd come here to destroy her dreams in person.
"Send them in," Elena said quietly. "Miss Castellanos, you don't have to speak to them if you don't want to." But Maria was already standing, straightening her blazer, lifting her chin the way her father had taught her when facing down bullies in the school playground. "No, I want to hear what they have to say." Marcus entered first, his presence filling the room like smoke from a bad fire. Behind him, James moved with the calculated confidence of a man accustomed to closing deals, while Roberto hung back, his discomfort obvious. "Elena," Marcus said, ignoring Maria entirely, "I hope you haven't signed anything yet. There are some serious legal issues with this whole arrangement." "Good morning, Marcus," Elena replied coolly. "I believe you know your sister Maria." For the first time, Marcus looked directly at her, and Maria saw something she'd never seen in his eyes before. Genuine fear. Not anger. Not contempt, but the raw terror of a man who'd realized he'd made a catastrophic mistake. "Maria, we need to talk. Privately." His voice was controlled, but she could hear the strain beneath it. "I think anything you have to say can be said in front of Ms. Cordova. After all, she's my business partner now." James stepped forward, his realtor's training allowing him to maintain his professional demeanor even as his world crumbled. "Maria, be reasonable. You don't understand what you're getting into. Mining operations are incredibly complex, expensive, risky. You could lose everything." "As opposed to losing nothing, which is what you left me with?" "We left you with more than nothing," Marcus snapped, his control finally cracking. "We could have contested Dad's will entirely. We could have had you declared financially incompetent. Instead, we let you have the worthless property nobody wanted." "Worthless?" Maria laughed, and the sound carried an edge that made even Marcus take a step back. "Is that what you're calling $400 million in platinum now? Worthless?" The silence that followed was electric. Roberto actually went pale, sinking into a chair without being invited to sit. James's practiced smile finally faltered. And Marcus
Marcus looked like a man watching his entire empire crumble in real time. "You don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Tom Hendricks sends his regards. Remember him? The geologist you told to send his report to the family lawyer? The one with the assay results showing massive platinum deposits? The report you buried so Dad would never know he'd been right all along." The accusation hung in the air like a blade. Roberto made a sound that might have been a sob. James stared at Marcus with dawning horror, and Marcus straightened his tie and became the cold, calculating businessman who had built his fortune by stepping on anyone who got in his way. That report was inconclusive, preliminary findings at best. We made a business decision based on incomplete information. You made a decision to let our father die thinking he was a foolish. You had proof that everything he believed about that mine was true, and you buried it because it was more convenient for you to think of him as a foolish old man. Dad was obsessed, Marcus exploded, his composure finally shattering completely. He spent his entire life chasing fantasies, pouring money we didn't have into that goddamn hole in the ground. He bankrupted himself, bankrupted our family, all for what? So you could waltz in 30 years later and get rich off of his delusions? No, Maria said quietly, her voice cutting through his rage like a knife through silk. So I could prove that sometimes the dreamers are right, and sometimes the people who think they're smarter than everyone else are just cruel. Elena cleared her throat. Gentlemen, unless you have some legal basis for your claims, I think this meeting is over. Ms. Castellanos and I have business to conclude. This isn't over, Marcus said, pointing at Maria with a finger that shook with rage. You think you can just take what's rightfully ours? You think we're going to let some welfare case destroy everything we've built? Welfare case? The words triggered something primal in Maria, something that had been building for weeks, months, years of condescension and dismissal. I work 2 jobs to keep a roof over my son's head. I've never asked you for anything except basic human decency, which apparently was too much to expect. And now you want to take the one thing that might give us a better life? She stepped closer to Marcus, close enough to see the fear he was trying so hard to hide. You want to fight? You've got one. But remember, big brother, you're the ones who taught me that family doesn't mean anything when there's money involved. Don't be surprised when I've learned that lesson better than you have. After they left, Marcus storming out with promises of legal warfare, James trying to broker some last-minute compromise, Roberto mumbling apologies that meant nothing, Maria sat back down across from Elena's desk. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she spoke. How bad is this going to get? Elena studied her for a long moment. They'll challenge the auction, claim it was improperly conducted. They'll argue that the mineral rights weren't properly included in the sale. They'll probably try to have you declared mentally incompetent to make major financial decisions. She paused. They might even try to have Danny taken away, claim you're an unfit mother who's making reckless decisions that endanger your child's welfare. The last possibility hit Maria like a physical blow. Danny taken away and given to people who saw him as nothing more than a pawn in their game? Danny growing up thinking his mother had failed him the way everyone said she failed at everything? What do I need to do? First, we get you the best legal representation money can buy. I know people who specialize in exactly this kind of dispute. Elena opened her laptop and began typing. Second, we accelerate our timeline. The longer this drags out in court, the more expensive it becomes for everyone. If we can get preliminary extraction started and establish clear ownership through productive use, it becomes much harder for them to challenge. How much will that cost? A lot. But Maria... Elena smiled, and it wasn't the polished business smile she'd worn earlier. This was something warmer, more personal. I've been in mining for 25 years. I've seen people strike it rich and lose everything. I've seen families destroyed by greed and good people crushed by those with more power and money. But I've also seen justice happen, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. She closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. Your brothers made one critical mistake. They assumed you'd fold under pressure. that you'd take whatever settlement they offered and disappear quietly. They're thinking of you as the same desperate woman who couldn't afford to fight them over your father's estate. What if they're right? What if I can't handle this? Then you'll learn. The same way your father learned to read geological surveys, the same way you learned to survive as a single mother with no support system, the same way you learned to see value where everyone else saw waste. Elena stood and walked to her window, looking out over the town that was about to become the center of a mining boom that would change everything. Your brothers have money and lawyers and connections, but you have something they don't. What's that? You have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. In my experience, that makes people capable of extraordinary things. That evening, Maria sat at Danny's bedside watching him sleep in the apartment they'd have to leave in 10 days. His school backpack sat ready for tomorrow, containing the field trip permission slip she'd finally been able to sign, the lunch money she'd scraped together, and a drawing he'd made of the two of them standing in front of a house with an actual yard. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is just the beginning. Drop the mining contract and we can work something out. Keep fighting and you'll lose everything, including your son. M." Maria stared at the message until the words blurred, then deleted it without responding. Outside their window, storm clouds gathered over Devil's Ridge, and somewhere in those dark tunnels that had swallowed 3 generations of Castellanos' dreams, $400 million worth of platinum waited in the earth like a promise that this time, maybe this time, the Dreamans would finally win. But first, she had to find them a new place to live. Because even when you're on the verge of becoming one of the richest women in Colorado, you still have to figure out where your 7-year-old son is going to sleep tomorrow night. The war for the Castellanos mine had begun, and Maria was about to learn that some battles are won not with money or lawyers or connections, but with the simple, stubborn refusal to let cruel people define the limits of what you're allowed to hope for. Thunder rolled across the mountains like the echo of dynamite, and Maria Castellanos began making lists of everything she'd need to become someone her brothers had never imagined she could be. She was making coffee in their tiny kitchen when her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord. "Need to talk. Important. Call me."
Ray Gutierrez had been a decent landlord for the 2 years she'd been renting the studio apartment. He'd given her extensions on rent, looked the other way when Danny's bicycle stayed chained in the hallway, even fixed their leaky faucet without charging extra. But his voice on the phone carried a tension she'd never heard before. "Maria, I'm sorry, but I've got to ask you to move out. End of the month." The words hit her like ice water. "Ray, what? Why? Did I do something wrong? Is it the rent? Because I can catch up this week, I promise." "It's not the rent." His voice was tight, uncomfortable. "Look, I got a call yesterday from Marcus Castellanos. He made me an offer on this whole building. Cash, above market value. But he was very specific about one thing. The current tenant in 2B has to be out before the sale closes." Maria sank into one of their 2 mismatched kitchen chairs, the phone trembling in her hand. "He can't do that! You can't just kick me out because—" "Maria, I'm sorry. I got 3 kids of my own to think about. And this offer, it's enough to pay off my mortgage and set up college funds for all of them. I can't turn it down." Ray's voice carried genuine regret, but also the finality of a decision already made. "I'll give you your security deposit back, plus an extra $1,000 to help with moving expenses, but I need you out by the 31st. After she hung up, Maria sat in the pre-dawn silence of their apartment, watching the numbers on their ancient microwave clock tick forward. 6:17 a.m. In 13 days, she and Danny would be homeless, unless she could find another place they could afford. In a town where decent apartments were scarce and her credit history read like a catalog of financial disasters, that seemed as likely as finding gold in their kitchen sink. But she wasn't the same woman who had stood on the courthouse steps 3 weeks ago, clutching $800 in a desperate dream. The preliminary geological surveys Tom had arranged were showing results that made her hands shake when she read them. Conservative estimates put the platinum deposit at $400 million. Conservative estimates. Maria showered and dressed for work, but instead of her McDonald's uniform, she put on the one professional outfit she still owned. a navy blazer she'd bought for job interviews after college, paired with pants she'd hemmed herself, and shoes that were polished but couldn't hide their age. Today, she had a meeting that would determine whether she remained Maria Castellanos, desperate single mother, or became Maria Castellanos, mining heiress. The offices of Cordova Mining Consortium occupied 3 floors of the nicest building in town, glass and steel rising above the old downtown like a promise of prosperity. Maria never imagined she'd walk through these doors as anything other than someone begging for a job. Now the security guard nodded respectfully as he directed her to the executive elevator. Elena Cordova was waiting in her corner office, and Maria understood immediately why this woman had built one of the most successful mining operations in the Southwest. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a way that was elegant but practical, and eyes that seemed to catalog and assess everything they saw. But when she smiled at Maria, the expression was warm, genuine. "Miss Castellanos, please sit. Can I offer you coffee, water?" "Coffee would be great, thank you." Maria settled into a leather chair that probably cost more than she made in 2 months, trying not to let her nervousness show. "I've reviewed Tom Hendricks' geological reports," Elena said, settling behind her desk with 2 steaming mugs. "I've also had my own team do independent verification. What you have up on Devil's Ridge is extraordinary." She opened a laptop and turned the screen toward Maria. Satellite imagery showed the mine property from above, but overlaid with colored sections that meant nothing to Maria's untrained eye. "The platinum veins run in 3 primary directions," Elena explained, using a laser pointer to trace the patterns. "Based on core samples from 12 different locations, we're looking at one of the richest platinum deposits discovered in North America in the last 50 years. Our conservative estimate is $400 million in extractable platinum. Our optimistic estimate," she paused, meeting Maria's eyes, $800 million. 800 million. Maria felt the number settle in her chest like a physical weight. More money than she could comprehend, hidden beneath land that had been in her family for generations. "Here's what I'm proposing," Elena continued. "Cordova Mining will handle all aspects of development and extraction. We'll provide the initial investment, approximately $50 million for equipment, infrastructure, and environmental compliance. In return, we take a 60% stake in the operation. You retain 40% ownership and receive quarterly payments based on extraction proceeds." Elena slid a thick contract across the desk. "Our preliminary calculations suggest you'd be looking at somewhere between $12 and $20 million annually once we reach full production, for the next 20 to 30 years. Maria stared at the contract, its legal language dense and intimidating. But the numbers at the bottom were clear enough. Even at the conservative estimate, she was looking at enough money to ensure Danny could go to any college he wanted, that they'd never worry about rent or food or medical bills again. "There is one complication," Elena said gently. "I received a call this morning from a law firm representing Marcus, James, and Roberto Castellanos. They're claiming the mineral rights sale was invalid, that you didn't have legal authority to purchase them." "What?" Maria looked up sharply. "I bought the property at a public auction. Everything was legal." "I'm sure it was, but they're threatening to tie this up in court, which could delay development for years. Litigation like this, it's expensive, time-consuming, and there's always risk." Elena leaned forward. "They also made me a direct offer to purchase the mining rights from them, claiming they're the rightful owners." The coffee turned bitter in Maria's mouth. Of course. Her brothers had finally figured out what they'd lost, and now they wanted it back. "What did you tell them?" "That we only deal with the legal owner of the record, which is you. But Maria, I need you to understand what you're up against. Your brothers have resources, connections, expensive lawyers.
They're going to make this as difficult as possible." As if summoned by their conversation, Elena's assistant knocked and entered. "Miss Cordova, there are 3 gentlemen here to see you. They say it's urgent regarding the Castellanos mining contract." Maria's stomach dropped. Through the office's glass walls, she could see them in the reception area. Marcus in his $1,000 suit, James with his practiced realtor smile, Roberto looking uncomfortable but determined. They'd come here to destroy her dreams in person. "Send them in," Elena said quietly. "Ms. Castellanos, you don't have to speak to them if you don't want to." But Maria was already standing, straightening her blazer, lifting her chin the way her father had taught her when facing down bullies in the school playground. "No, I want to hear what they have to say." Marcus entered first, his presence filling the room like smoke from a bad fire. Behind him, James moved with the calculated confidence of a man accustomed to closing deals, while Roberto hung back, his discomfort obvious. "Elena," Marcus said, ignoring Maria entirely, "I hope you haven't signed anything yet. There are some serious legal issues with this whole arrangement." "Good morning, Marcus," Elena replied coolly. "I believe you know your sister, Maria." For the first time, Marcus looked directly at her, and Maria saw something she'd never seen in his eyes before. Genuine fear. Not anger, not contempt, but the raw terror of a man who'd realized he'd made a catastrophic mistake. "Maria, we need to talk, privately. I think anything you have to say can be said in front of Ms. Cordova. After all, she's my business partner now." James stepped forward, his realtor's training allowing him to maintain his professional demeanor even as his world crumbled. "Maria, be reasonable. You don't understand what you're getting into. Mining operations are incredibly complex, expensive, risky. You could lose everything. As opposed to losing nothing, which is what you left me with? We left you with more than nothing. We could have contested Dad's will entirely. We could have had you declared financially incompetent. Instead, we let you have the worthless property nobody wanted." "Worthless?" Maria laughed, and the sound carried an edge that made even Marcus take a step back. "Is that what you're calling $400 million in platinum now? Worthless?" The silence that followed was electric. Roberto actually went pale, sinking into a chair without being invited to sit. James's practiced smile finally faltered, and Marcus looked like a man watching his entire empire crumble in real time. "You don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Tom Hendricks sends his regards. Remember him? The geologist you told to send his report to the family lawyer? The one with the assay results showing massive platinum deposits? The report you buried so Dad would never know he'd been right all along? That report was inconclusive, preliminary findings at best. We made a business decision based on incomplete information." "You made a decision to let our father die thinking he was a failure," Maria shot back. "You had proof that everything he believed about that mine was true, and you buried it because it was more convenient for you to think of him as a foolish old man." "Dad was obsessed," Marcus exploded, his composure finally shattering completely. "He spent his entire life chasing fantasies, pouring money we didn't have into that goddamn hole in the ground. He bankrupted himself, bankrupted our family, all for what? So you could waltz in 30 years later and get rich off his delusions?" "No," Maria said quietly, her voice cutting through his rage like a knife through silt. "So I could prove that sometimes the dreamers are right, and sometimes the people who think they're smarter than everyone else are just cruel." Elena cleared her throat. "Gentlemen, unless you have some legal basis for your claims, I think this meeting is over. Ms. Castellanos and I have business to conclude." "This isn't over," Marcus said, pointing at Maria with a finger that shook with rage. "You think you can just take what's rightfully ours? You think we're going to let some welfare case destroy everything we've built?" Welfare case? The words triggered something primal in Maria, something that had been building for weeks, months, years of condescension and dismissal. I work 2 jobs to keep a roof over my son's head. I've never asked you for anything except basic human decency, which apparently was too much to expect. And now you want to take the one thing that might give us a better life? She stepped closer to Marcus, close enough to see the fear he was trying so hard to hide. You want to fight? You've got one. But remember, big brother, you're the ones who taught me that family doesn't mean anything when there's money involved. Don't be surprised when I've learned that lesson better than you have. After they left, Marcus storming out with promises of legal warfare, James trying to broker some last-minute compromise, Roberto mumbling apologies that meant nothing. Maria sat back down across from Elena's desk. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she spoke. How bad is this going to get? Elena studied her for a long moment. They'll challenge the auction, claim it was improperly conducted. They'll argue that the mineral rights weren't properly included in the sale. They'll probably try to have you declared mentally incompetent to make major financial decisions. She paused. They might even try to have Danny taken away. Claim you're an unfit mother who's making reckless decisions that endanger your child's welfare. The last possibility hit Maria like a physical blow. Danny, taken away and given to people who saw him as nothing more than a pawn in their game. Danny, growing up thinking his mother had failed him the way everyone said she failed at everything. What do I need to do? First, we get you the best legal representation money can buy. I know people who specialize in exactly this kind of dispute. Elena opened her laptop and began typing. Second, we accelerate our timeline. The longer this drags out in court, the more expensive it becomes for everyone. If we can get preliminary extraction started and establish clear ownership through productive use, it becomes much harder for them to challenge. How much will that cost? A lot, but, Maria, Elena smiled, and it wasn't the polished business smile she'd worn earlier. This was something warmer, more personal. I've been in mining for 25 years. I've seen people strike it rich and lose everything. I've seen families destroyed by greed and good people crushed by those with more power and money. But I've also seen justice happen, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. She closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. Your brothers made one critical mistake. They assumed you'd fold under pressure, that you'd take whatever settlement they offered and disappear quietly. They're thinking of you as the same desperate woman who couldn't afford to fight them over your father's estate. What if I'm right? What if I can't handle this? Then you'll learn. The same way your father learned to read geological surveys, the same way you learned to survive as a single mother with no support system, the same way you learned to see value where everyone else saw waste. Your brothers have money and lawyers and connections, but you have something they don't. What's that? You have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. In my experience, that makes people capable of extraordinary things. That evening, Maria sat at Danny's bedside watching him sleep in the apartment they'd have to leave in 10 days. His school backpack sat ready for tomorrow, containing the field trip permission slip she'd finally been able to sign, the lunch money she'd scraped together, and a drawing he'd made of the two of them standing in front of a house with an actual yard.
Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is just the beginning. Drop the mining contract and we can work something out. Keep fighting and you'll lose everything, including your son, M. Maria stared at the message until the words blurred, then deleted it without responding. Outside their window, storm clouds gathered over Devil's Ridge, and somewhere in those dark tunnels that had swallowed 3 generations of Castellanos' dreams, $400 million worth of platinum waited in the earth like a promise that this time, maybe this time, the dreamers would finally win. But first,
She had to find them a new place to live, because even when you're on the verge of becoming one of the richest women in Colorado, you still have to figure out where your 7-year-old son is going to sleep tomorrow night. The war for the Castellanos mine had begun, and Maria was about to learn that some battles are won not with money or lawyers or connections, but with the simple, stubborn refusal to let cruel people define the limits of what you're allowed to hope for. The courtroom felt like a cathedral of judgment, its high ceilings and dark wood paneling designed to intimidate those who dared challenge the established order. Maria sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, watching as her brother's legal team arranged their artillery of briefcases and legal documents. 3 months had passed since Marcus had made his first threat, 3 months of legal maneuvering and court filings and depositions that had consumed her days and haunted her nights. She and Danny were living in a motel now, the Sunset Inn, where the neon sign flickered and the air conditioning wheezed like an old man's lungs. $28 a night, paid day by day because she couldn't afford to book a week in advance. Danny had adapted with the resilience of childhood, turning their cramped room into an adventure. But Maria saw the questions in his eyes when other kids talked about their bedrooms, their backyards, their normal lives. All rise for the Honorable Judge Catherine Morrison. Judge Morrison was a woman in her 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of human greed and foolishness during her decades on the bench. She settled into her chair and surveyed the courtroom with the expression of someone preparing to cut through nonsense with a very sharp blade. This is the matter of Castellanos v. Castellanos regarding the disputed ownership of mining rights on the property known as Devil's Ridge. Her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Before we begin, I want to make something clear to all parties. This court has reviewed the preliminary filings, and I am not impressed by the level of acrimony displayed in this family dispute. We will proceed with facts and law, not emotion and vendetta. Marcus's lawyer, a man named Harrison Pike, who charged $500 an hour and looked like he enjoyed crushing people for sport, rose first. Pike had been imported from Denver specifically for this case, and his opening statement was a masterpiece of legal theater. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about fraud and exploitation. The defendant, Maria Castellanos, took advantage of a clerical error to purchase property that was never intended for public auction. The mineral rights to Devil's Ridge have been in dispute for years, tied up in complex estate litigation that was still ongoing when Miss Castellanos made her unauthorized purchase. He clicked a remote, and a presentation screen descended from the ceiling. Charts and graphs filled the display, showing property valuations and legal precedents that made Maria's head spin. Furthermore, Your Honor, we have evidence that Miss Castellanos colluded with outside parties to manipulate the auction process, using inside information to gain an unfair advantage over other potential bidders. Pike's voice carried the conviction of a man accustomed to winning through superior firepower. Maria's lawyer, Janet Chen, was half Pike's age and charged a tenth of his hourly rate, but she rose with the quiet confidence of someone who'd built her career on David and Goliath cases. Elena Cordova had recommended her personally, and Maria had learned to trust Elena's judgment about people who understood the true value of fighting for justice. Your Honor, this case is actually quite simple. Maria Castellanos purchased property at a legally conducted public auction following all established procedures. She paid the required amount, received a valid deed, and has acted in good faith throughout this process. Her brother's claims of fraud and collusion are without merit and appear to be motivated by buyer's remorse. They realized too late that they'd sold valuable property for far less than it was worth. Janet moved to her own presentation, and suddenly the courtroom screen filled with a different kind of evidence. Newspaper clippings showing the auction announcement, official county records documenting the legal notice period, photographs of the brothers at the courthouse on auction day, clearly aware that the sale was taking place. The plaintiffs were present at the courthouse on the day of the auction, They made a conscious decision not to bid. They cannot now claim the auction was invalid simply because they miscalculated the property's value. But it was Pike's next move that nearly shattered Maria's composure entirely. "Your Honor, we'd like to call our first witness, Roberto Castellanos." Roberto took the stand with obvious reluctance, avoiding Maria's eyes as he was sworn in. Under Pike's gentle questioning, he painted a picture of Maria as an unstable, desperate woman who'd become obsessed with her father's mining delusions. "She was always encouraging Dad's fantasies," Roberto said, his voice barely audible. "Even when it was clear the mine was worthless, she'd talk to him about geological surveys and ore deposits. She fed his obsession because she thought someday it would pay off for her." The words stung because they contained just enough truth to be believable. Maria had encouraged her father's dreams because she'd been the only one who bothered to understand them. While her brothers sought embarrassing failure, she'd seen a man who refused to give up hope. "And you believe she had access to geological reports that influenced her decision to purchase the property," Pike continued. "She was always going through Dad's papers after he died. She could have found things, information the rest of us didn't know about." It wasn't perjury exactly. It was worse. It was the kind of selective truth that made lies sound reasonable. Janet's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Castellanos, you testified that your sister encouraged your father's interest in mining. Did you or your brothers ever show similar interest?" We thought it was a waste of time." "Did you ever visit the mine with your father?" "No." "Did you ever review any geological reports or mining surveys he might have commissioned?" Roberto shifted uncomfortably. There might have been some paperwork." "Paperwork you ignored because you'd already decided the mine was worthless?" "We made reasonable business decisions based on available information. Information you chose not to investigate thoroughly." Pike objected before Roberto could answer, but the damage was done. Janet had exposed the fundamental weakness in their case. The brothers were claiming fraud based on information they'd been too arrogant to examine themselves. Marcus took the stand next, and his testimony was polished, professional, and devastating. He spoke about Maria's financial instability, her history of poor decision-making, her inability to maintain steady employment. He made her sound like someone barely capable of caring for her own child, let alone managing a multi-million-dollar mining operation. It was a masterful performance, and Maria could see its effect on Judge Morrison's expression. Everything Marcus said was technically true, and it painted her as exactly what she'd always been seen as: the family failure, the cautionary tale, the one who'd made bad choices and should be grateful for whatever scraps her successful brothers might throw her. But then Janet stood for her cross-examination, and Maria saw something in her lawyer's eyes that made her heart race with possibility. "Mr. Castellanos, you testified that you made reasonable business decisions regarding the mine property. Can you tell the court about the geological report commissioned by your father in the months before his death?"
The question landed like a bomb in the careful architecture of Marcus's testimony. His face went pale, then flushed red as he realized the trap he'd walked into. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." Janet moved to the evidence table and lifted a thick folder. "This is a geological survey conducted by Tom Hendricks at your father's request, completed approximately 3 months before Miguel Castellanos' death. Were you aware of this report?" "There were various documents." "Documents that included preliminary assay results showing significant platinum deposits on the Devil's Ridge property?" Pike was on his feet immediately. "Objection! This document hasn't been properly authenticated." "Your Honor," Janet replied smoothly, "Tom Hendricks is present in the courtroom and available to authenticate his work." The judge nodded. The witness will answer the question. Marcus looked like a man watching his execution. There may have been some preliminary findings that suggested the property contained platinum ore worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The reports were inconclusive. Inconclusive enough that you decided not to share them with your dying father. The silence that followed was deafening. In the gallery, Maria could see people leaning forward, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys. "We made a business decision not to raise false hopes," Marcus said finally. "False hopes about a deposit that independent geological surveys have now confirmed to be worth over $400 million? Pike's objections came like machine gun fire, but it was too late. The truth was spreading through the courtroom like water through a broken dam, and no amount of legal maneuvering could contain it. When Tom Hendricks took the stand, his testimony was devastating in its quiet precision. He walked the court through his methodology, his findings, his attempts to contact the family with the results. He produced phone records showing his calls to Marcus, emails that had gone unanswered, copies of the report that had been sent to the family lawyer, and buried in files never meant to see daylight. "In my professional opinion," Tom said, "the Devil's Ridge property contains one of the most significant platinum deposits discovered in North America in the last 50 years. Conservative estimates place its value at $400 million. More optimistic productions suggest it could be worth as much as $800 million. The numbers hung in the air like a revelation. $800 million. Hidden beneath land the brothers had sold for $800 because they were too proud to believe their father might have been right about something. But it was Elena's final witness that delivered the killing blow. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Elena Cordova to the stand." Elena moved through the courtroom with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room she entered. Her testimony was crisp, professional, and absolutely damning. "Miss Cordova, you're the CEO of Cordova Mining Consortium." "Yes, I am." "And you've entered into a development agreement with Maria Castellanos regarding the Devil's Ridge property." "We have. Based on our independent geological surveys, we believe this property represents one of the most valuable mining opportunities in the region." "Have you been contacted by the plaintiffs in this case?" Elena's smile was sharp as a blade. "Yes, Marcus Castellanos called me approximately 2 weeks after Ms. Castellanos and I signed our initial agreement. He offered to sell me the mining rights for $50 million, claiming that his sister's purchase was invalid." The admission sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Marcus had tried to sell mining rights he didn't own for $50 million, a tenth of their actual value, but still enough to make him obscenely wealthy. "What was your response?" "I told him that we deal only with the legal owner of record, which is Maria Castellanos. And I also told him that if he continued to interfere with our development timeline, we would consider legal action for tortillas interference." Pike's redirect was desperate, unfocused. He tried to suggest that Elena was biased, that mining companies routinely exaggerated the value of deposits to attract investors. But Elena had been in the business for 25 years, and she demolished his implications with the cold precision of someone who'd built an empire by being right more often than anyone else. The second payment had been $15.2 million. By the third, she'd stopped feeling shocked and started feeling responsible. This wasn't just money, it was power, opportunity, the ability to change, not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. She'd bought a house first, a modest ranch-style home on 10 acres outside of town, where Danny could have the dog he'd been wanting and she could have the garden she dreamed about during those long nights in the motel. Not a mansion. She wasn't ready for that kind of attention yet. But a home with enough bedrooms for them each to have their own space, with a kitchen large enough for the kind of cooking she remembered from her childhood, when her grandmother would fill the house with the smell of fresh tortillas and laughter. The second thing she'd done was establish the Miguel Castellanos Foundation, named for her father
and dedicated to supporting single mothers pursuing education and training in technical fields. The foundation's first recipient had been Sandra, her former manager at McDonald's, who'd used a grant to complete her nursing degree and was now working at the county hospital. "You didn't have to do this," Sandra had said through tears when Maria presented her with the check. "Yes, I did," Maria had replied. "Someone has to prove that people who work at McDonald's are capable of more than anyone gives them credit for." The foundation now supported 47 women across 3 states, providing not just money, but mentorship, childcare assistance, and the kind of holistic support Maria wished she'd had during those dark years. She'd hired Janet Chen to run the foundation's legal affairs, and Tom Hendricks to oversee a new program providing geological training to women interested in mining careers. But perhaps the most satisfying use of her newfound wealth had been the systematic dismantling of her brother's attempts to continue their war against her. Marcus had tried first to challenge the mining permits, claiming environmental concerns. When that failed, he'd attempted to have Maria investigated for tax evasion, suggesting that no one could legitimately transition from poverty to wealth so quickly. When the IRS audit concluded that all her affairs were perfectly legal and properly documented, he'd tried to have Danny's custody challenged, claiming that sudden wealth made her an unfit parent. Each attack had been more desperate than the last, and each had failed more spectacularly. Maria had learned to fight with resources her brothers couldn't match, not just money, but the kind of moral authority that came from being legitimately wronged and publicly vindicated. The final confrontation had come 6 months ago, at their mother's funeral. Carmen Castellanos had died peacefully in her sleep at 81, surrounded by rosaries and family photographs that told the story of a woman who'd loved imperfectly, but completely. The funeral mass had been packed. Their mother had been beloved in their small community, known for her kindness to neighbors and her fierce defense of anyone she saw as vulnerable. After the service, as mourners gathered in the parish hall for the traditional meal, Marcus had cornered Maria by the dessert table. He looked older, worn down by 18 months of failed schemes and public humiliation. The golden boy, who'd once commanded every room he entered, now carried himself like a man who'd discovered that success built on other people's failures was more fragile than he had imagined. "Are you satisfied now?" he'd asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You've destroyed everything Dad built, everything this family stood for." "What did Dad build, Marcus? What did this family stand for?" Maria had replied, ladling herself a bowl of pozole with steady hands. "Because from where I'm standing, Dad built a dream that you buried along with the man who dreamed it. And this family stood for nothing more than making sure the weakest member knew her place." "You were weak," Marcus had spat. "You made bad choices, bad decisions. You had a kid you couldn't afford with a man who wouldn't stick around. You worked at McDonald's, for Christ's sake. What were we supposed to do, pretend that was success?" Maria had set down her bowl and looked at her brother. Really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since childhood. She'd seen the fear there, the confusion of a man who'd built his entire identity on being superior to someone who'd just proven superiority was more complicated than he had understood. "You were supposed to love me," Maria had said simply. "Not because I was successful or because I made good choices or because I reflected well on you. You were supposed to love me because I was your sister, and that was supposed to mean something." The words had hit Marcus like physical blows. For a moment, his carefully constructed facade had cracked, and she'd seen something that might have been grief or regret or the kind of loss that comes from realizing you've spent years hating someone who never deserved your hatred. But then the facade had reformed, harder and more brittle than before. "Love doesn't pay bills, Maria. Love doesn't build businesses or create jobs or make communities better. Money does that. Success does that." "Then why," Maria had asked, "are you so miserable?" She'd walked away then, leaving Marcus standing alone by the dessert table, while she went to find Danny, who was playing with his cousins in the church playground, as if the adult world of grudges and greed couldn't touch him. Now, standing on Devil's Ridge and watching her fortune literally being pulled from the earth, Maria thought about that conversation. Marcus had been right about one thing. Money did pay bills, did create opportunities, did have the power to change communities. But he'd been wrong about love. Love was what kept her fighting when fighting seemed impossible. Love was what made her risk $800 she couldn't afford on a dream everyone said was worthless. Love was what made this victory meaningful rather than just profitable.
Miss Castellanos? Elena appeared at her elbow, tablet in hand, wearing the kind of smile that suggested good news. The latest assay results from the deep core samples. Maria took the tablet, her heart racing as she read the numbers. The platinum vein ran deeper than anyone had projected, wider and richer than the most optimistic estimates. Conservative projections now put the total value at over $1 billion. $1 billion, hidden beneath land her family had owned for generations, but never had the courage to fully explore. "There's something else," Elena said, scrolling to another screen. "We found indications of rare earth elements in the lower strata. If those pan out, we're looking at potentially strategic-level deposits, the kind that governments get interested in." Maria handed back the tablet, her mind already racing through the implications. More money than she could spend in several lifetimes, but also more responsibility. The kind of wealth that attracted attention from people far more dangerous than her bitter brothers. "What do you recommend?" "Carefully," Elena said. "Very carefully. We expand extraction gradually, maintain tight security, and make sure we understand exactly what we're dealing with before we announce anything that might attract unwanted interest." That evening, Maria sat at the kitchen table in their new home, helping Danny with his math homework as she reviewed geological reports and extraction schedules. It was a scene that would have been impossible to imagine 2 years ago. The desperate woman counting out $20 bills transformed into someone planning the development of one of the most valuable mineral deposits in North American history. Danny looked up from his worksheet, his pencil tapping against the table in a rhythm that reminded her achingly of her father. "Mom, are we rich now?" It was a question he'd been asking in various forms for months, as their circumstances changed in ways he could see but not fully understand. New house, new car, new clothes, new confidence in his mother's voice when she talked to teachers and doctors and other adults who used to make her nervous. "We have enough money that we don't have to worry about having enough money. But more important than that, we have something else now." "What?" "We have choices. We can choose what we want to do, where we want to live, how we want to help other people. We can choose to be the kind of people who use what we have to make things better." Danny nodded solemnly, already learning that privilege came with responsibilities. He'd been with her when she'd visited the foundation recipients, when she'd toured schools that needed equipment, when she'd met with other single mothers who reminded her of who she'd been such a short time ago. "Will Uncle Marcus ever stop being angry at us?" It was the question she'd been dreading, the one that cut to the heart of what they'd gained and lost in their transformation. Danny had noticed that his uncles no longer came to family gatherings, that their names were spoken in whispers at church, and that the extended family had split into factions that regarded Maria's success with everything from admiration to envy to outright resentment. "I don't know, mijo. Sometimes people get so used to thinking about someone one way that they can't see them any other way, even when everything changes. But we still love them, right? Even if they're mean to us?" Maria paused, her pen hovering over a contract amendment. Did she love her brothers? After everything they'd done, everything they'd tried to take from her, everything they'd cost her father in his final months? It would be easy to say no, to write them off as casualties of their own cruelty and greed. But love, she was learning, was more complicated than that. She loved the boys they'd been before. Ambition and success had hardened them into men who could watch their sister struggle without feeling compelled to help. She loved the memory of playing together as children before they'd learned that love could be conditional,
that family could be a competition where only some members were allowed to win. "Yes," she said finally. "We love them, but that doesn't mean we have to let them hurt us." As if summoned by their conversation, her phone buzzed with a text from Roberto. "Maria, can we talk? Not about the mine or money. About family, please." She stared at the message for a long time, remembering Roberto as he'd been on the witness stand, uncomfortable, reluctant, clearly torn between loyalty to his brothers and recognition that what they were doing was wrong. Of the three, he'd been the least vicious in his attacks, the most conflicted about the war Marcus had declared. She texted back, "Saturday afternoon, the new house, just you." Roberto arrived on Saturday looking older than his 31 years, driving a sedan that had seen better days, and wearing clothes that suggested his financial situation had deteriorated significantly since the court case. Maria met him on the front porch, not quite ready to invite him into the home that represented everything he'd tried to help his brothers take from her. "Nice place," he said, and there was no sarcasm in his voice, just a kind of weary acknowledgement. "You always had good taste, even when we couldn't afford to indulge it." We sat on the porch swing Maria had installed specifically for moments like this, times when she needed to remember what peace felt like, what it meant to be still and safe and unafraid of tomorrow. "How are Marcus and James?" she asked, not because she cared about their welfare, but because she needed to understand what she was still up against.
Struggling? Marcus lost the commercial development contract when his partners found out about the lawsuit. Turns out investors don't like working with people who sue their own family members over imaginary grievances. Roberto's laugh was bitter. James is selling insurance now. His real estate license got suspended after some clients complained about his aggressive tactics. Maria felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and sadness. She'd never wanted to destroy her brothers, just to protect what was hers. But Marcus had turned their conflict into total war. And in wars, even the winners lost something precious. "And you?" "I'm managing a Wendy's now. Turns out my restaurant experience doesn't transfer as well as I hoped when you've got a reputation for family drama." Roberto looked at her directly for the first time since arriving. "I deserve it. What we did to you, what we tried to do, there's no excuse for it." "No," Maria agreed. "There isn't. But I need you to know something. That night, when Marcus first talked about challenging the sale, I told him it was wrong. I told them both that you'd bought the property fair and square, that we should congratulate you and move on." His voice broke slightly. "But they said if we didn't stick together, if we let you get away with stealing what was rightfully ours, then everything Dad had worked for would be meaningless." "What Dad worked for was never meaningless, even when you all thought it was." "I know that now. But Marcus made it seem like letting you keep the mine would somehow dishonor Dad's memory, like we'd be betraying everything he'd taught us about family loyalty and working hard for what you earn." Maria studied her brother's face, seeing in it echoes of the boy who'd helped her catch fireflies in the backyard when they were children. Roberto had always been the follower, the one who went along with his older brother's plans because challenging them required a kind of courage he'd never developed. "What do you want from me, Roberto?" "I want—" He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. "I want to apologize. Not just for the lawsuit, but for everything. For the years we made you feel like you weren't good enough, like your dreams didn't matter, like being our sister wasn't enough reason for us to support you." The apology hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was sure the other would cross. "And I want to ask if maybe, someday, when you've had time to heal from what we put you through, maybe Danny could get to know his uncles. Not Marcus and James. They're still too proud and too angry. But me, I want to try to be the uncle he deserves, the brother you deserved all along." Maria felt tears threatening,
the first she'd allowed herself to shed over her family's fracturing. Roberto's words weren't enough to erase the damage that had been done, but they were a beginning, a recognition that family could be rebuilt, that people could change, that love might be stronger than pride if given enough time and space to work. Danny asks about you sometimes, about all of you. He doesn't understand why his uncles don't come to visit anymore. What do you tell him? That sometimes people make mistakes that take a long time to fix, that love doesn't disappear just because people hurt each other, but trust has to be earned back, slowly. They talked for another hour, carefully rebuilding the foundations of a relationship that had been shattered by greed and misunderstanding. Roberto told her about his life, his struggles, his growing recognition that success meant more than money and status. Maria told him about the foundation, about her plans to use the mine's wealth to create opportunities for other people who had been written off as failures. When he left, they hugged for the first time in 3 years, and Maria felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, exactly, but the possibility of forgiveness, which was sometimes enough to begin healing. That night she stood in Danny's doorway watching him sleep, marveling at how peaceful he looked in his own bedroom, in their own house, surrounded by the security she'd thought so hard to provide. Tomorrow the extraction would continue, pulling more wealth from the earth than she'd ever dreamed possible. Tomorrow she'd continue building the foundation that would help other women transform their lives. Tomorrow she'd take another step towards becoming the woman her father had always believed she could be. But tonight, she was simply Maria Castellanos. No longer the desperate single mother who'd risked everything on an impossible dream, but not yet comfortable calling herself one of the wealthiest women in Colorado. Tonight she was suspended between who she'd been and who she was becoming, grateful for the journey and excited about the destination. Outside her window, Devil's Ridge rose against the star-filled sky like a promise finally kept. Somewhere in those dark tunnels, her great-grandfather and grandfather had dreamed of treasure that would change their family's fortune. Her father had spent his lifetime believing that dream was possible. Now it was real, and Maria Castellanos had become the woman who'd made it reality. Not through luck or accident, but through the simple, revolutionary act of refusing to let other people define the limits of what she was allowed to hope for. The mountain had been waiting all along for someone brave enough to claim its gifts. It had taken 4 generations, but the Castellanos family had finally found their treasure hunter.
5 years later, the auditorium at Colorado State University was packed beyond capacity, with students sitting in aisles and spilling out into the hallway as Dr. Maria Castellanos prepared to deliver the keynote address for the School of Mining Engineering's annual symposium. She stood at the podium in her doctoral robes, the PhD in geological sciences she'd earned through night classes and summer intensives while managing a billion-dollar mining operation, and looked out at an audience that included some of the most respected names in her field. But her eyes found and held on 2 faces in the front row that mattered more than all the rest. Danny, now 14 and growing into the kind of young man who carried himself with quiet confidence, and Elena Cordova, whose partnership had evolved from business arrangement to something resembling the mother-sister relationship Maria had never known she needed. When I purchased the Devil's Ridge property 5 years ago for $800, Maria began, her voice carrying easily to the back of the auditorium, I thought I was buying hope. What I actually bought was a lesson in the difference between value and worth, between what things cost and what they're truly worth paying for. The laughter that rippled through the audience was warm, appreciative. These were people who understood that the woman standing before them represented something extraordinary, not just success, but transformation on a scale that challenged every assumption about who was allowed to win and how victory was supposed to look.
The Devil's Ridge mine has now produced over $2 billion in platinum and rare earth elements, making it one of the most valuable mineral deposits in North American history. But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here to talk about the real treasure that was hidden in those mountains, the discovery that sometimes the people the world writes off as failures are just people who haven't been given the right opportunities to show what they're capable of achieving. Maria clicked to her first slide, a photograph of the Miguel Castellanos Foundation's headquarters, a beautiful facility built on the outskirts of their hometown, where the old copper processing plant had once stood. 15 years ago, this foundation was an idea I had while living in a motel, with my son, wondering how we were going to afford his next school lunch. Today, it provides full educational scholarships, business development loans, and comprehensive support services to over 800 women across 12 states. The next slide showed a grid of photographs: women in graduation caps, women in hard hats at construction sites, women in lab coats, women starting businesses, women who'd been where Maria had been and were now becoming who she'd become. Sarah Martinez was managing a convenience store in New Mexico when she received our first business development loan. Today, she runs a successful consulting firm that helps small mining operations improve their environmental compliance. Dr. Jennifer Kim was working 3 jobs to support her children while pursuing her engineering degree when our foundation provided her with childcare assistance and a scholarship. She now holds 6 patents in sustainable extraction technology. Maria paused, letting the weight of those success stories settle over the audience. Lisa Chen was homeless with 2 children when she applied for our emergency housing assistance program. She's now a certified heavy equipment operator, making 6 figures a year and owns her own home. These women didn't need someone to give them success. They needed someone to give them opportunity. The presentation continued for 40 minutes, weaving together the technical aspects of the mine's development with the human stories that had grown from its proceeds. Maria spoke about innovative extraction techniques that minimized environmental impact, about partnerships with universities that were training the next generation of female mining engineers, about economic development programs that had transformed their small mountain town into a model of sustainable prosperity. But perhaps most powerfully, she spoke about the children, Danny and hundreds like him, who were growing up in a world where their mother's dreams weren't treated as impossible fantasies, where single parenthood wasn't synonymous with inevitable failure, where the circumstances of your birth didn't determine the boundaries of what you were allowed to achieve. My father, Miguel Castellanos, spent 30 years believing in something everyone else thought was worthless. He died thinking he was a failure, that his dreams were just delusions, that the mountain he loved had rejected his faith in its possibilities. He never got to see that he was right about everything: the geology, the value, the potential for transformation that was waiting in that dark earth. Her voice caught slightly, and she took a moment to compose herself. But I think he would be proud, not of the money we've extracted from his mountain, but of what we've chosen to do with it. He believed that if you worked hard enough, if you had faith enough, if you refused to give up when everyone else said you should, then someday you'd find treasure. What he might not have understood is that the real treasure isn't what you find, it's what you do with what you find that defines whether you've truly struck gold. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, and Maria stood at the podium feeling something she'd never experienced before. Not just success, but the deep satisfaction of knowing that her success meant something beyond her own comfort and security. After the symposium, she drove the familiar mountain roads towards Devil's Ridge, where the evening shift was just ending at the mine that had made her one of the richest women in America. The operation employed over 400 people now, with wages and benefits that had attracted families from across the region. What had once been a dying mountain town was now thriving, its main street lined with new businesses, its school system funded well enough to attract teachers from major cities, its young people choosing to stay rather than flee to more promising places.
Danny rode beside her in comfortable silence, working on homework in the passenger seat with the casual confidence of a teenager who'd grown up secure in the knowledge that his mother could handle anything the world threw at them. He'd inherited her father's curiosity about the earth and its secrets, but also something new, an understanding that knowledge was most valuable when it was shared, that success was most meaningful when it lifted others along with yourself. "Mom," he said, without looking up from his chemistry textbook, "I've been thinking about college applications." "Already? You're only a freshman." "I know, but I want to plan ahead. I've been looking at programs in environmental engineering, maybe geology like you studied. I want to understand how to make extraction operations more sustainable, how to minimize ecological impact while maximizing social benefit." Maria smiled, hearing echoes of conversations she'd been having with her own team of scientists and engineers. That's important work. The future of mining depends on people who understand that we have a responsibility to the earth and the communities where we operate. Plus, Danny added with the grin that still reminded her of the little boy who'd once slept on a mattress they'd found on the sidewalk, someone needs to be ready to take over the family business eventually. The family business. It was still strange to think of herself as someone who had a business to pass down, a legacy to leave behind. But that's what the mine had become, not just a source of wealth, but a platform for the kind of generational change that transformed not just families, but entire communities. They reached Devil's Ridge as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of copper and gold that reminded Maria of the first time she'd stood here as the property's owner. The massive extraction equipment had been shut down for the evening, leaving a silence that felt profound after years of constant industrial activity. Tom Hendricks was waiting for them at the site office, now serving as the operations chief geologist at a salary that allowed him to buy a house and finally retire the 20-year-old pickup truck he'd been driving when they first met. In his hands, he held a folder that Maria recognized immediately, geological survey results that still arrived with the same sense of anticipation they'd carried 5 years ago. "What did the deep core sample show?" she asked, accepting the folder with hands that no longer trembled when presented with potentially life-changing information. "You're going to want to sit down for this," Tom said, but he was grinning with the excitement of someone who'd spent his entire career hoping to make one truly extraordinary discovery. "We've confirmed the presence of lithium deposits in the lower strata, high-grade lithium in quantities that could supply the entire North American battery manufacturing industry for decades." Maria opened the folder, scanning numbers that had become as familiar to her as grocery prices once were. Conservative estimates put the lithium deposit's value at over $3 billion, but the implications went beyond money. Lithium was the cornerstone of the renewable energy revolution, essential for electric vehicle batteries, grid-scale energy storage, and the transition to a clean energy economy. "We're not just looking at wealth anymore," Tom continued. "We're looking at strategic national importance. This could be one of the most significant mineral discoveries in American history." Danny looked up from his homework, finally understanding the magnitude of what they were discussing. "Mom, this means we have even more responsibility than we thought, not just to our community or even our country, but to the future of the planet." That night, Maria stood alone on her back porch, looking up at Devil's Ridge silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Somewhere in those mountains, her great-grandfather and grandfather had broken their backs, chasing dreams that seemed impossible to everyone except them. Her father had died believing those dreams were delusions, never knowing that he'd been sitting on top of resources that could power humanity's transformation to sustainable energy. And now she, Maria Castellanos, the girl who'd been written off as the family failure, the young woman who'd been abandoned by her child's father, the single mother who'd worked at McDonald's while dreaming of impossible things,
was the steward of discoveries that would shape the next century of human development. Her phone buzzed with a text from Roberto, who had become a regular presence in their lives over the past few years. His journey back to the family was slow, careful, marked with small gestures of respect and growing trust. He managed the Foundation's community outreach programs now, using his natural empathy and hard-earned humility to connect with families facing the same struggles Maria had once known. "Saw your speech online. Dad would be so proud. We all are." She smiled, remembering the long road that had led from that first tentative conversation on her front porch to this moment of shared pride. Roberto had kept his promise to earn back their trust, proving through consistent action that people could change, that families could heal, that love was indeed stronger than pride when given time and space to work.
Marcus and James remained estranged, still too proud to admit they'd been wrong, still convinced that Maria's success was somehow an injustice inflicted upon them rather than a victory earned through courage and persistence. She'd heard through Roberto that Marcus was struggling with his construction business, that James had moved to Arizona and was selling solar panels with moderate success. She felt no satisfaction in their difficulties, but no guilt either. They'd made their choices, and she'd made hers. Elena appeared on the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee, settling into the chair beside Maria with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd shared both the struggles and triumphs of the past 5 years. Their business partnership had evolved into something deeper, a friendship built on mutual respect and shared values that transcended the mere making of money. "Thinking about the lithium discovery?" Elena asked. "Thinking about responsibility. 5 years ago, I was desperate enough to risk $800 I couldn't afford on a dream everyone said was worthless. Now I'm sitting on resources that could power the world's transition to clean energy, and I have to figure out how to use that responsibly." "You'll figure it out," Elena said with quiet confidence. "You always do. That's what made you different from your brothers. You never saw wealth as an end in itself. You always saw it as a tool for building something better." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lights twinkle in the valley below, where a community had grown prosperous not just because of the mine's payroll, but because of the careful attention Maria had paid to ensuring that prosperity was shared, sustainable, and aligned with the values that had driven her from the beginning. The Miguel Castellanos Foundation, now operated in 12 states, had provided over $40 million in direct assistance to women and families in need, and had helped establish similar programs in 3 other countries. The Devil's Ridge operation employed not just miners and engineers, but teachers, researchers, environmental scientists, and community development specialists who worked to ensure that resource extraction served human flourishing rather than just corporate profits. But perhaps most importantly, Maria had become living proof that the circumstances of your birth, your family's expectations, society's assumptions, the balance in your bank account, didn't determine the boundaries of what you were allowed to achieve. She'd become a symbol of the truth she'd always carried in her heart, that sometimes the people the world writes off as failures are just people who haven't been given the right opportunities to show what they're capable of. "There's something else," Elena said eventually, "something I've been meaning to discuss with you. The Department of Energy has been in touch about the lithium deposits. They want to classify the mine as a strategic national asset and provide federal funding for accelerated extraction in exchange for guaranteed supply contracts." Maria nodded, having expected this conversation. Strategic minerals were too important to national security to remain entirely in private hands, and she'd always known that true success would eventually require navigating the complex intersection of private enterprise and public interest. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that my father spent his whole life believing that the mountain wanted to provide for people, that if we approached it with respect and worked hard enough, it would give us what we needed to build something better." Maria sipped her coffee,
tasting the satisfaction of decisions made with clear conscience and steady purpose. I think he'd want us to find a way to serve both prosperity and the public good. That's not always easy to balance. No, Maria agreed, but that's what makes it worth doing. As the evening deepened and the mountain settled into quiet, Maria thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The desperate woman who'd clutched $800 and bought hope had become someone responsible for resources that could shape the future of civilization. The single mother who'd worked at McDonald's while dreaming of impossible things had become Dr. Maria Castellanos, mining executive, philanthropist, and living proof that the American dream, battered and scarred and often betrayed, could still deliver justice to those brave enough to demand it. But more than that, she'd become someone her father would recognize, a dreamer who'd learned to make dreams real, a believer who'd turned belief into action, a woman who'd inherited not just his hope, but his understanding that the Earth's treasures were meant to be shared, meant to build communities, meant to serve the kind of future worth leaving to the children who would come after them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new responsibilities. The lithium discovery would require careful planning, thoughtful development, and the kind of long-term thinking that prioritized sustainability over short-term profit. The foundation would continue expanding, reaching more families, changing more lives, proving again and again that investing in people was the most profitable venture anyone could undertake. Danny would continue growing into the kind of young man who understood that privilege came with obligations, that success was measured not just by what you accumulated, but by what you contributed, and that the best way to honor those who'd come before you was to build something better for those who would come after them. Tonight, Maria Castellanos sat on her porch and marveled at the simple miracle of security, the ability to plan for tomorrow without fear, to make decisions based on values rather than desperation, to love freely without the constant anxiety that love alone wouldn't be enough to protect the people she cared about.
Above them, Devil's Ridge stood sentinel against the stars, its secrets finally revealed, its treasures finally serving the purposes for which they had been waiting all along. The mountain that had broken the hearts of 3 generations of Castellanos men had finally found the right person at the right time, someone who needed it as much as it needed her, someone with the courage to transform dreams into reality and the wisdom to understand that reality, once achieved, was only the beginning of what was possible. The girl who'd bought a dragon's cave for $800 had learned that the dragon had been guarding treasures beyond imagination. But more than that, she learned that the greatest treasure wasn't what was hidden in the dark tunnels beneath the mountain, it was the light that had guided her there, the love that had sustained her through the darkness, and the unshakable belief that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible was only impossible until someone was brave enough to make it real. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains like the echo of blasting powder in tunnels where dreams came true, and Maria Castellanos smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd finally come home to herself. The boardroom on the 40th floor of the Castellanos building in downtown Denver commanded a view of the Rocky Mountains that never failed to take Maria's breath away. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see Devil's Ridge in the distance, still crowned with the industrial infrastructure that had made her family name synonymous with responsible mining and sustainable development. But today, her attention was focused on the documents spread across the mahogany conference table, papers that would complete a transformation that had begun with $800 desperate 15 years ago. Maria, now 43, had grown into the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Her hair showed streaks of premature silver that she wore like badges of honor, and her hands, once soft from office work, then rough from desperation, then steady from hard-won confidence, now bore the calluses of someone who still insisted on understanding every aspect of her operations from the ground up. Across the table sat representatives from 3 of the world's largest technology companies, along with officials from the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection Agency. The lithium extraction project had taken 5 years to develop properly, 5 years of environmental impact studies, community engagement sessions, and technological innovation that had resulted in the most sustainable rare earth mining operation in the world.
The Castellanos method, as it had come to be known in mining circles, extracted lithium with 90% less water usage and 60% less environmental disruption than traditional methods. More importantly, it had become the template for responsible resource development that dozens of other operations worldwide were now adopting. "Dr. Castellanos," said Jennifer Walsh, the lead negotiator from Tesla's battery division, "the contracts we're proposing represent the largest sustainable lithium supply agreement in history. 20-year guaranteed pricing with built-in escalators for environmental performance bonuses. The total value exceeds $12 billion, Maria finished, having reviewed every page of the contracts with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to grocery store coupons. "But the value isn't what matters to me. What matters is what we're building together." She stood and walked to the windows, gesturing toward the mountains that had shaped her family's destiny for 4 generations. "My great-grandfather died in those tunnels chasing copper that was worth pennies per pound. My grandfather bankrupted himself trying to extract minerals that barely cover the cost of extraction. My father spent 30 years believing in something everyone else thought was worthless and died thinking he was a failure." Maria turned back to face the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned that true power came not from wealth, but from the wisdom to use wealth well. "Now we're sitting on resources that will power the clean energy revolution for the next century. But I didn't survive homelessness, single parenthood, and a family that tried to destroy me just to become another billionaire who extracts wealth from the earth without giving back more than she takes." She clicked a remote, and the wall screen displayed a map of North America dotted with green markers. Each of these points represents a Castellanos Foundation Center, 237 locations across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. They've provided education, training, and support services to over 15,000 women and their families. The women who've graduated from our programs now generate over $800 million annually in economic activity. The next slide showed photographs, women in graduation caps, in business suits, and hard hats, holding patents and standing in front of companies they'd built. Sarah Martinez had grown her environmental consulting firm to a 50-person operation that helped mining companies across the Southwest improve their sustainability practices. Dr. Jennifer Kim's extraction technologies are being used in operations from Mongolia to Chile. Lisa Chen now owns and operates a fleet of heavy equipment that employs 30 other women in jobs that pay union wages with full benefits. "This is what success looks like," Maria continued. "Not just the wealth we've extracted from the earth, but the human potential we've extracted from poverty, discrimination, and the kind of systemic dismissal that told all of these women, told me, that we weren't worth investing in." Daniel Castellanos, now 24 and fresh from completing his dual PhD in environmental engineering and sustainable business from MIT, entered the boardroom carrying a tablet that displayed real-time data from the mine's operations. He'd grown into the kind of young man who carried himself with quiet confidence, inheriting his mother's analytical mind and his grandfather's stubborn optimism, but tempering both with a generation's worth of awareness about environmental and social responsibility. "Mom, the latest extraction dye is remarkable," he said, taking his place at the table with the easy familiarity of someone who'd grown up understanding that business was a family affair, but that family extended far beyond blood relations. "We're exceeding all efficiency projections while maintaining 0 environmental violations for the 6th consecutive year." Maria felt the familiar surge of pride that came not just from Danny's professional accomplishments, but from watching him become the kind of person who measured success by its positive impact rather than just its bottom line. He had spent his summer breaks working alongside foundation recipients, understanding that privilege came with responsibilities that extended far beyond family boundaries. "The numbers are impressive," said Robert Kim from the Department of Energy, "but what's truly extraordinary is the community developing model. The Devil's Ridge operation doesn't just extract resources, it's become an economic engine that's transformed an entire region while maintaining ecological integrity." That was true. The small mountain town that had been dying 15 years ago was now thriving with a population that had tripled, unemployment near 0, and a school system that attracted families from across the region. But more importantly, it had become a model for how resource extraction could serve community development rather than exploit it. Main Street, once lined with empty storefronts, now bustled with businesses owned by people who'd been given opportunities to build something better. The old McDonald's, where Maria had once worked minimum wage, had been replaced by a community center that provided childcare, job training, and small business development services. The motel where she and Danny had lived during their darkest months was now a museum and educational center that told the story of how desperation could be transformed into determination, how dreams deferred weren't necessarily dreams denied. "There's one more thing," Maria said, returning to her seat and opening the final folder on the table. "The contracts we're discussing today will generate more wealth than I could spend in several lifetimes. But wealth without purpose is just accounting. I want to announce the establishment of the Global Sustainable Development Institute." She handed copies of the proposal to everyone present. $50 billion, provided through an irrevocable trust to establish research and development centers focused on sustainable resource extraction, renewable energy technology, and community-centered economic development. The first centers will be built in regions where traditional extractive industries have left behind environmental damage and economic devastation. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. $50 billion, more than many countries' annual budgets, dedicated to proving that human prosperity and environmental sustainability weren't opposing forces, but complementary aspects of intelligent development. "Dr. Castellanos," Jennifer Walsh said carefully, "this represents nearly half of your projected lifetime earnings from the lithium contracts. Are you certain about committing resources of this magnitude?" Maria smiled, remembering another question asked in another context many years ago. "Are you sure about this?" She'd been sure then about risking $800 she couldn't afford. She was even more sure now about investing $50 billion she could. "When I was working at McDonald's, making barely enough to keep my son fed, I used to dream about having enough money that we wouldn't have to worry about money anymore. When I got that, I started dreaming about having enough money to help other people not have to worry about money. When I got that, I realized the real dream wasn't about money at all. It was about proving that the world could work differently, that success could be measured by how many people you lift up rather than how much you accumulate." Danny looked at her with the expression of someone who'd grown up watching his mother transform not just their own circumstances, but the entire definition of what success could look like. "The Institute will focus on replicating the Castellanos method globally. The method, yes, but more importantly, the philosophy behind it, that communities should benefit from the resources in their regions, that environmental protection and economic development can work together, that the people who do the work should share in the profits, that women and marginalized communities aren't charity cases, they're untapped sources of innovation and leadership that the world can't afford to waste." As the meeting concluded and contracts were signed that would reshape the global lithium market, Maria found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The desperate woman who'd stood on the courthouse steps 15 years ago, clutching $800 in a dream everyone said was impossible, had become someone with the power to influence global energy policy and international development priorities. But the transformation that mattered most wasn't financial. It was the evolution from someone who had been written off by her own family to someone whose family now extended to thousands of women and their children around the world, all connected by the simple belief that everyone deserved opportunities to build something better. That evening, Maria and Danny drove the familiar mountain roads toward Devil's Ridge for what had become a monthly tradition, dinner at the Mines Community Center, where current and former employees gathered to share meals and stories. The facility served as both cafeteria and social hub, designed to foster the kind of community connections that made work feel like more than just employment. Roberto was waiting for them, his transformation over the past decade as remarkable as Maria's in its own way. He'd grown from a man broken by shame and regret into someone who'd found purpose in service to others, managing the Foundation's community outreach programs with the kind of passionate dedication that came from personal experience with second chances. "The Institute announcement is all over the news," he said, embracing them both with the warmth of someone who learned to cherish family connections he'd once taken for granted. $50 billion! Maria, do you realize what this means? It means we're just getting started, she replied. It means that everything we've built here was just the prototype for what's possible when you combine resources with values. When you measure success by its positive impact rather than just its profit margins. They sat at a table with Tom Hendricks, now 72, but still sharp as the geological surveys he'd been conducting for nearly 5 decades. His discovery of the platinum deposits had changed all their lives, but he seemed most proud of the university partnerships that had resulted in dozens of graduate students conducting research at Devil's Ridge, advancing the science of sustainable extraction. Your father would have loved seeing this, Tom said, gesturing around the community center where children played while their parents attended evening classes in everything from business development to renewable energy technology. Miguel always believed that the mountain wanted to provide for people, that the Earth's treasures were meant to build communities rather than just individual fortunes. He was right about that, Maria said. He was right about everything, actually. He just didn't live long enough to see it proved. Elena Cordova joined them, her hair now completely silver, but her energy undiminished by 70 years of life that had included building one of the most successful mining operations in the world. She'd become something like a mother figure to Maria, the relationship filling spaces that had been carved out by family dysfunction and abandonment. I have something for you, Elena said, handing Maria a small wrapped package. Something I've been saving for the right moment. Inside was a photograph, black and white and clearly decades old, showing a young man standing at the mouth of a mine tunnel. He wore work clothes and a hopeful expression, and despite the passage of time, his resemblance to Danny was unmistakable. That's your great-grandfather, Miguel Castellanos Sr., the first one to work the Devil's Ridge property. I found it in some old mining records I was researching for the Institute's historical documentation project. Maria stared at the photograph, seeing in her great-grandfather's face the same stubborn optimism that had driven her father, the same refusal to accept that dreams were impossible just because other people said they were. 4 generations of Castellanos men and women had poured their hopes into the mountain, and finally, the mountain had revealed its treasures to someone wise enough to understand that treasures were meant to be shared. As dinner concluded and the community center began to empty, Maria found herself standing outside in the crisp mountain air, looking up at the stars that her ancestors had wished upon for generations. Danny stood beside her, now tall enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, still marveling at the confident, compassionate young man he'd become. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how many people had to believe in impossible things for us to be standing here tonight. About how many women are going to have opportunities now that they wouldn't have had otherwise. About how many children are going to grow up believing that their dreams matter, that their family's circumstances don't determine their futures. About legacy?" Maria smiled. "About love, actually. About the difference between success that serves itself and success that serves others. About proving that sometimes the people the world writes off are just people who haven't been given the right opportunities yet." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the lights of the mining operation twinkle in the valley below, listening to the distant sounds of machinery that never stopped working to transform the Earth's hidden gifts into technologies that would power a cleaner, more sustainable future. In her pocket, Maria's phone buzzed with messages from around the world. Congratulations on the Institute announcement, requests for interviews, invitations to speak at conferences and universities. She'd become almost accidentally one of the most influential voices in global development, someone whose opinions on sustainable business practices and community-centered economic policy were sought by governments and corporations worldwide. But the message that mattered most was a simple text from Marcus. "Saw the news about the Institute. Dad would be proud. We all are." It had taken 15 years, but Marcus had finally found a way to acknowledge what his sister had accomplished without diminishing himself in the process. It wasn't a full reconciliation. Too much damage had been done for that. But it was recognition respect, and perhaps the beginning of something that could eventually become healing. Maria Castellanos had started with $800 in a dream that everyone said was worthless. She was ending with resources that could reshape global energy policy and development practices for generations to come. But more than that, she'd proved that the most valuable treasure hidden in Devil's Ridge wasn't platinum or lithium or rare earth elements. It was the demonstration that love, properly applied, could move mountains, both literally and figuratively. The girl who'd bought a dragon's cave had learned that the dragon had been guarding not just gold, but the secret to transforming the world, one dream at a time, one family at a time, one impossible possibility at a time. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains like applause from the earth itself, and Maria Castellanos smiled with the deep satisfaction of someone who learned that the best treasures weren't the ones you found. They were the ones you created by refusing to let anyone else define the limits of what you were allowed to hope for.